Hi, everyone. Thanks for taking the time to join us today. I'm going to give everyone a couple minutes to get logged in here because I know we just hit 1 o'clock. Then we'll get started shortly thereafter. I think we had a good bit of registrants for this one, so we'll make sure everyone can join first. Me and Christina are here in Buffalo today, so let us know where you're joining us from because we'd love to see what everyone's up to. We'll start in the chat. All right. So, hi, Rhonda. Hi, Sam. All right. So, hi, everyone. Thank you so much for joining us today. We're very excited to have you on this webinar. If you don't know, my name is Marissa, and I'm the Content Marketing Manager here at Kangarootime. Today, we have one of our favorite partners and guests, Christina Fecio, here with us for a webinar. Like I said, she's in Buffalo as well, so she's a great local partner of ours, and we love working with her. She is an educational consultant, and she's here today to share more on helping your employees develop an ownership mindset. But before she kicks it off, I'm just going to share a little bit about Kangarootime and what we do in case you're not familiar. So we are a software company. We have a platform for childcare centers designed to help you optimize and grow your business. But beyond that, our main goal is really just to help childcare providers like you in any way we can. So we always provide resources like these webinars and articles in our blog. And we also have a conference. So every year we are hosting a conference called Bounce. We have great speakers come in from all over the country, just like Christina. You probably would recognize a few of them, but we also have some new faces this year to kind of change things up. So if you're looking for a great networking opportunity and professional development experience, it's going to be here in Buffalo this summer. It's a lot of fun. It's 2 days full of content, over 14 hours of continued education credit, and we'd love to see you guys there. So I'm going to put the link in the chat. And I'm also going to give you guys a special code for $100 off. So you can save a little bit of money because we did just extend our early bird pricing. So take advantage of that while you can. And then a couple housekeeping announcements. We will give you a certificate for this webinar. You'll get that either today or tomorrow in an email along with the recording. If you have any questions throughout, be sure to use either the chat function or the Q&A, and either I or Christina will answer those. And your microphone and camera are off, so we cannot hear you, we can't see you, so feel free to keep doing what you're doing. You're not going to disrupt anyone. Okay, so for today's session, we have Christina Fecio. I'm sure a lot of you are familiar with her. She is a problem solver. She has over 20 years of experience in organizational leadership, program development, and engagement strategy with a focus in education. So she creates customized professional development solutions to support teams and individuals like you. So she does wear very many hats. She's a speaker, a writer, a strategist, and we're very excited to have her on today. Today, she is going to be presenting on engaging your employees and helping them develop an ownership mindset so they can buy into your mission, vision, and values at your center. So welcome, Christina. Thank you so much for joining.
Thank you for the beautiful introduction, Marissa, and thanks to Kangarootime for inviting me. Are you ready to get started?
Yes, please.
Okay,
kick it off.
great. All right. Well, I first want to just thank all of you for joining us today. And even if you're someone who ends up watching this video later, I appreciate you taking the time to invest in your professional development. I know that we are all often spread very thin. So the fact that you take the time to invest in yourself and your own learning and growth, I think, is admirable. So thank you for doing that. Just to give you an idea of what to expect today, as Marissa said, I'm here to talk with you about developing an ownership mentality that is both in yourself and in your employees, because I think it's pretty impossible actually to expect anything from your employees unless you are there to be as a role model of the same. So we're going to spend some time talking about things like responsibility and accountability and how those relate to ownership. We're going to spend some time talking about something called the Oz principle. If you happen to be familiar with the Oz principle, I'd love for someone to add that to the chat. It's new to me in the past few years, and I was really glad to have found it. So we'll dig into that a little bit. I do have some slides to share with you. So I think what happens then is I end up in a little corner of your screen. I'm really bad at multitasking with the technology, meaning that if you do put something in the chat and I don't see it, Marissa will call my attention to it, and we'll make sure that we have a little time at the end for questions. So with that said, give me just a second to share my screen, pull up some slides for you. Sorry, you see all my little tech updates that I probably should have moved earlier, but tech savvy is not my thing. All right, so we're here today to talk about developing an ownership mentality. At the most basic level, I would say that an ownership mentality is about taking responsibility for your work. Something is a little wonky with my slides. Marissa and I ran through this earlier and there we go. Sorry about that. So at the most basic level, an ownership mentality is all about taking responsibility for your work. It's about setting high standards, and it's about delivering results. It's about approaching your job with a true sense of pride and striving for excellence in literally everything that you do. I once heard someone describe it as, I make decisions like I'm the owner of the business. And I thought about that. I said, what do you mean you make decisions like you're the owner of the business? And he said, literally, I mean it exactly the way that it sounds. Every decision I make that influences my behavior, that influences my interactions with children, with customers, with families, with the community, I make it as though I am responsible for everything that's related to this company. And I was really impressed by that. That made me dig into this idea of an ownership mindset a little bit more. So when you think about that, think about that for a minute. Can you imagine that you have a team where everyone has high standards, everyone takes pride in their work, and everyone strives for excellence? To me, those sound like ideal employees. And I mean, to be honest, it sounds like a great place to work. I'm not sure. Actually, you know what? I'm pretty confident. I'm pretty confident that I'm not alone when I say that I want to work for people and with people who care so much about this work that we're doing that it shines through in their behavior every single day. I want to work with people who have high standards. I want to work for people who have high standards, because that shows me that we have some alignment in our values. In this field in particular, early childhood education, high standards are how we keep children safe, and it's how we help them thrive. So to me, that's a non-negotiable. So in my experience, this mindset, developing it in our teams, really requires a solid understanding of responsibility and accountability. So as I mentioned when we got started, in our time together today, we'll spend a little bit of time unpacking both of those concepts and the ways that they relate to ownership. I plan to share some strategies that can help you help your employees. And as you'd expect, that would involve maybe reflecting on your own habits and sometimes making some shifts in your own mindset too. Okay, so let's get started with the idea of responsibility and accountability, starting first with responsibility. Responsibility refers to a set of duties or a set of tasks that an individual is expected to perform. So accountability and responsibility, they're related, but they are distinctly different concepts. When responsibility hyper-focuses on duties or tasks, that means, for example, a teacher might be responsible for completing a checklist or for some compliance-related tasks. And then their manager might be responsible for overseeing the teacher or overseeing a team of teachers and ensuring that they complete those tasks on time. On the other hand, accountability, it's a little bit different. It focuses a little bit more about answerability or results. It focuses on the consequences of your actions and of your decisions. It involves being able to explain and justify your actions be able to explain and justify your decisions and behaviors. And most importantly, it involves accepting the consequences of those actions and of all the decisions related to those actions. So using that same teacher example, if the teacher fails to complete her checklist or the items that are on the list, she might be required to provide an explanation to the manager, and she's accountable to the manager in that way for the consequences related to that. The manager, in turn, is accountable to the licensing agency or the owner, or however that internal structure looks. So that's how we end up with a situation where, in those unfortunate circumstances where there's a licensing violation, the teacher may have been the one who was responsible for the task, but more than just the teacher is accountable for the task and for the consequences related to that task. So if you wanted to summarize it neatly, I'm thinking you could say that responsibility is task-oriented and accountability is more results-oriented. Both of these are pretty essential components of an ownership mentality. And you know what, let me tell you a little bit about how I first came to this topic and started developing it for people who are working in early childhood. A few years ago, I was approached by a client that has a group of centers in the Manhattan area, or actually throughout the boroughs. And they were in a situation where we had done some work together before with their leadership team, but they really wanted to focus on how their leadership team and their directors could better support their teachers because they were going through a transition. The specific transition that they were going through is that they had transferred their corporate structure or changed their corporate structure where they were becoming an employee-owned business. So every employee would literally have an ownership stake in the business, literally. A little bit different from what we're talking about in terms of mentality. But I realized that when they asked me to dig into this, when they said, you know, we really want to focus on how we can support our staff and really making them feel like owners. Their day-to-day work isn't going to dramatically change. You know, the preschool teacher who's coming today and delivering excellent service for children and families today, the same is going to be true tomorrow, even when we have this transfer of ownership and the structure changes. But when we look at the big picture, we want to change how they feel about coming to work. We want them to understand that this accountability really is a mindset, that this ownership, that they really basically wanted them to feel like they were making decisions as though they owned the company, regardless of what their title was. So I was intrigued. And the first thing that I realized is pretty much any work that I had done before on leadership, on accountability, on responsibility, it was all going to tie into this topic of ownership. But I wanted a little bit of a better understanding of how ownership differed from those things and how it sort of took things to the next level. So I dug a little bit into the nuance, into the complexity of it. And there were not a ton of surprises because, as you'd expect, people who are responsible generally have high standards. People who are accountable generally have good judgment, generally take pride in their work. But we needed to sort of find the perfect recipe for ownership, making sure that people weren't just showing up and doing the job, and actually weren't just showing up and doing it well either, but they were coming to work striving for excellence. And I realized that's like I said, that's the kind of people that I wanted to work for and with too. So it was an interesting journey, and that's sort of what brought us here today. So we're coming from this place where we understand that responsibility and accountability are both essential components of this ownership mentality that we want to cultivate. When individuals have a really strong responsibility for their work, they're more likely to take ownership of it, and they're more likely to demonstrate that mentality that we're looking for. When they do take ownership of their work, they're more likely to be accountable for their actions and for their decisions. So it's all really intertwined. It's really hard to pull out the individual threads without pulling a little responsibility here, a little accountability here, and they get all tangled up in this little definition or more complex work of ownership. So when you think about your culture, a culture that encourages responsibility, accountability, and an ownership mentality, that really has a significant impact on the success of your organization. Whether you're a small child care center that's just getting started, you're a multi-site operation that has your policies and procedures are a well-oiled machine, you know that your reputation is the heart of your company's success. And your reputation really does rely on responsible, accountable employees who are striving for excellence, who aren't just coming up and showing up hopefully they are showing up, but they're coming to work, they're doing the work, and they're doing it with a sense of pride that propels them to go above and beyond, not in the like Pinterest perfect classroom type of way, but in a way that really fosters a sense of trust and a sense of accomplishment. The ownership mentality really does have a significant impact on your culture. It fosters that sense of trust, it fosters transparency, it fosters collaboration among team members. And when we think about how all those things interact together, that leads to better communication and it leads to more effective problem solving. I don't know about you, but I know that in my time as a center director and as a center administrator, problem solving was my primary job role. Sometimes we called it fighting fires, and that's what it felt like, just putting out one little fire over here, one little fire over here, and really hoping to just get through the day without that combusting into a huge explosion. What I've heard from directors and owners recently is, particularly through the pandemic years, that firefighting has felt like it's taking over your role sometimes. So when we can get to a place where your team members have consistent, more effective problem solving strategies, it gets you to a place where you're no longer fighting fires, where you're showing up as your best self as a leader. You're in a place where you can actually promote a culture where continuous improvement is your priority, where you can actually take some time to focus on novel ideas and innovation and how to change your business or enhance your business in meaningful ways. Because when people do start to develop this ownership mentality, they're more likely to take some risks, the healthy kind of risks, and they're more likely to try new approaches. So then they feel this sense of ownership over the work. They want to show up as their best self for you. And they're feeling like what I do today really makes a difference, not just with this one individual child or with this particular family, not just with my coworker who shares this space with me, but for everyone here, that I'm making a really valuable contribution to the success of this company, to the success of our center, of our program. So if we want to put it simply all together, I'd say that it's important to keep in mind that responsibility is task-oriented, accountability is results-oriented, and ownership, that's where it's a little bit more complex because it's values-oriented. So I really like this graphic as a visual for ownership because it does a really nice job of illustrating that complexity that I mentioned. It sort of illustrates the nuance. It shows that problem solving, taking initiative, learning from your mistakes, taking responsibility, even your personal brand, social responsibility, that it's all intertwined. It all matters. So it's important in illustrating that point that ownership is more than one behavior. It truly is a mindset. Personally, I believe, and I've found in my professional experience, that an ownership mindset relies on a three-step process. Those three steps are to identify your core values, to recognize actions or behaviors that align with those values, and to duplicate those behaviors until they become habits. So let's look at that again. An ownership mindset relies on three steps: identifying your values, recognizing behaviors that align with those values, and then duplicating those behaviors until they become habits. That holds true for us as individuals, as leaders and decision makers, but it also holds true for developing that mindset in others. Over time, I found that recognizing behaviors that align with your values is the absolute best way to help reinforce the importance of those values and to encourage your employees to demonstrate them in your work. I'm a big believer in this idea that what you focus on grows. Professionally and personally, I say it all the time. What you focus on grows. So, for example, if one of your top priorities is safety, which in this field, I'm sure that it is, then it makes really good sense to recognize a staff member that consistently follows safety protocols, the person that consistently follows the safety procedures. When you draw your attention to their attention to detail, and you make a point of telling everyone, both the person who engaged in the behavior and the people who are on the team with them, that their commitment to safety reflects your values of safety, your value of responsibility, your value of respect for others, people can then start to connect the dots. Your employees are reminded of your priorities, And they can observe a concrete way to live those values because you've drawn their attention to a behavior that they can duplicate. Drawing their behavior to behaviors that they can duplicate, drawing their attention to behaviors that they can duplicate, that's a win for everybody involved. If you've worked with me before, I use this analogy in a lot of different ways, but it sort of relates to the way that we assess and observe and interact with children. We know as educators that that really general sort of praise, like, great job, you're amazing, is important in the sense that it can help boost self-esteem, but it's not really enough. It's not sufficient. And it's definitely not sufficient for actually changing behavior. Instead, we have to give really, really specific feedback. That holds true for adults too. We need to draw their attentions to things that they can actually duplicate. So if you, for example, wanted to hyper-focus on integrity, if you were having an issue at your center with gossip, or if you really just wanted to, like I said, hyper-focus on integrity and communication and the way that people treat one another and take care of one another, it really makes sense to recognize an employee who did something like taking responsibility for a mistake. So if you have someone who made a mistake, but they completely owned it, they proceeded with integrity, they worked to find a solution, and they really did what it takes to remedy the situation. They were responsible for their mistake and they followed through. When you draw your attention to their honesty and you draw your attention to transparency and to the person's follow through, you can prevent similar mistakes because you've identified specific behaviors that others can duplicate. You've made it clear that it's okay to make a mistake, that it's human to make a mistake, but what matters most is your follow through. We don't hide things, we don't blame other people, we're transparent, we're honest, and we take accountability for it. We solve the problem that we created with this mistake. So I love the idea of identifying specific behaviors that others can duplicate because I think it's the recipe for success in terms of behavior change over time and really establishing really good habits. Okay. So if we're working from this understanding that developing an ownership mindset means taking full responsibility. It's taking full responsibility for your whole life, your choices, your actions. You're treating everything, it's literally everything you do, as though you own it. One of the things that I've found is a really great resource for developing this mindset in both yourself and your team is something called the Oz Principle. If you're not familiar, the Oz Principle is a book that describes the concept of accountability in the workplace. As you probably guessed, it draws its inspiration from The Wizard of Oz, and it might be a little cheesy in the fact that it uses the characters and the themes from the story to explain the sort of the principles of accountability, but it does a really, really good job arguing the fact that accountability is the key to achieving success. And it does a really good job of making that connection between accountability and an ownership mentality. It makes the ownership mindset idea make sense because it provides a solid framework. So this idea of the Oz principle is something we're going to dig into because it really helps make a practical understanding of both responsibility and accountability and the impact that those traits have on your team as you're working to cultivate this sense of ownership. So the Oz principle relies on the 4 key ideas that you see on the screen. See it, own it, solve it, and do it. If you were to purchase the book or if you were to dig into some of the online materials, and I'm not like, this is not a sponsored ad in any way, I just read voraciously because I feel like it's the best way for me to consume knowledge. And then I like to try out everything I learned to see if it really holds true out in the real world. So this is something that I have found really holds true. Like it doesn't just sound good when you read it. It actually includes practical tools and strategies that I could take back to my work with different school leaders and actually with leaders in lots of different industries. So to recap, basically, or to sum up the Oz principle in its most basic, it relies on these 4 things that you see on the screen. See it, own it, solve it, and do it. The basic definitions are listed there too. Acknowledging the problem, taking responsibility for it, determining what you can actually do, and then taking action. So if we were to take a look, see it it focuses on acknowledging the problem. So this involves basically you're recognizing the reality of the situation. You're acknowledging that there is a problem and there's a challenge that needs to be addressed. The strategies that they share, highlighted here, are common sense. They're very easy to do, but I've come to learn that anything that's easy to do is also easy not to do. So seeing it, acknowledging the problem, relies on a couple of different things. Getting the perspective of others, asking for and offering feedback, being realistic, being honest with yourself, which a sidebar that includes admitting your own mistakes, and considering all the facts. Now, each of these things, these aren't novel ideas to you. You've heard them as the basic tenets of good communication. You've certainly shared this information with your team in terms of professional and personal development. And yet, sometimes we struggle right in this initial place of just acknowledging the problem. We'll look at a slide and we'll dig into the content of it a little later, where the Oz principle gives us some examples of what they call leading above the line or the below the line. Above the line is these 4 strategies that they spell out, but below the line is what they call like blame storming, or where blame and taking the role of victim starts. And sometimes acknowledging a problem is something that pushes us below the line because we feel vulnerable, or we feel like things are going to steamroll and they're going to be out of our control, or because we just knew that this was going to happen because we didn't trust this particular employee. There's a lot of different reasons why sometimes we fail to acknowledge the problem in a meaningful way. Getting the perspective of others is a necessary first step, because there were many, many times that I was 100% sure as a building leader that I completely understood what had happened, despite the fact that I did not ask a single person what had happened. I was making my decisions and then the actions that followed those decisions based on my perception of the problem. That's a big mistake. And it's a rookie mistake, but it's one I repeated later in my career too, because it is human nature to sort of just rely on your own perspective and think, okay, I've got this. I've been here before, been here, done that. I'll just do what I did last time. I'll solve this. And my own personal toxic trait is, it would be easier if I just took care of it myself. Okay. Many, many school leaders come to me with that same mentality, because sometimes, I'm being honest, sometimes it is. It's more efficient for me to take care of things myself. But when I think about, if I roll it back to think about my focus on my values and what I really want to help other people grow, those value aligned behaviors, then I have to get them involved. And that starts with getting their perspective. That next bullet point, asking for and offering feedback, I will say that most individuals I know are fairly comfortable offering feedback, but those same individuals who are very comfortable offering feedback are often very uncomfortable asking for it. Again, I'll put myself in that category. It was a learning curve for me, because I realized that when I put myself out there asking for feedback, I was vulnerable, and I do not enjoy being vulnerable. I realized though that it's necessary, and I learned not to equate vulnerability with weakness. So I do ask for other people's feedback. I ask the hard questions, and then I really think about what they said. I don't try to do this. I used to do this weird thing where I would try to unravel what they said to me and think, well, what did they really mean? Sometimes I just need to assume positive intent, consider the facts that this person's giving to me, realize that I asked them for feedback, and then just take it. Take what they've given to me, that relates with being realistic and being honest with yourself too. Admitting your mistakes, that form of vulnerability is not always easy. And then considering all the facts. Often we get one side. If we do decide that we are going to get someone's perspective, sometimes we don't get the necessary perspective of all the people involved. And it is more time consuming, and it can involve a lot of he said, she said types of things, but considering all the facts really is an essential step to acknowledging the problem. And when you engage in each of these behaviors, you're modeling these behaviors for your team. You're being a role model of, how do I lead with integrity? And this is how we here as a school community take care of problems. We don't sweep them under the rug. We don't find someone to blame. We acknowledge the problem, we get people's perspectives, we're honest about it, and we're realistic. And to me, that feels really good. That aligns with my values in a way that I want it to, and that I want to model for others as well. So the second step is actually called Own It, and it means, as you'd expect, taking responsibility for it. Taking ownership of the situation, accepting your responsibility for finding a solution, It also means committing to the idea that the solution is in there. Like you have the potential, you have the ability to find the solution that lies within you and your skill set somewhere, and then to take the necessary actions to achieve that actual desired income. And that's all. There are opportunities for that to fall apart in lots of different places. I know that sometimes, I have not taken ownership of the situation and accepted responsibility for finding a solution because I felt like someone else should. You caused this problem. Why can't you be the one who finds the solution? To me, that ends up being a little bit of a selfish leadership trait. And I've learned that the hard way. I'm so personally invested in the work that I do and the work that we do for children and families that sometimes I feel so compelled to make it right that I go off in one of two directions. Either, like I said before, I do everything myself, or I feel like I might need to call out the person who created the mess and say, you need to fix your own mess. Neither one of those works really well. Finding the happy medium, that's basically what's displayed on your screen here. The happy medium, the most productive space for leadership and for role modeling and for cultivating the culture that you want. It involves being personally invested, of course, caring deeply. It involves reflecting on how I contributed to the problem, answering for personal commitments, meaning like so I've got this idea of the problem. I've acknowledged what the problem is. I've asked point blank, how did I contribute to this problem? Because if I'm going to be part of the solution, I need to really understand if and how I contributed to the problem itself. And then my personal commitment is like it sounds. I don't want to overpromise. I don't want to get overextended. I don't want to take away the opportunity for someone else to solve their own problem, but I need to make a personal commitment that makes sense based on the situation. So I'm owning it. I'm acting on the feedback that I've received. And most importantly, I'm aligning my work. I'm aligning what I do next, how I choose to take responsibility for it, with the results that our organization's trying to achieve. And if you're asking yourself, what are the results that we're trying to achieve? That's where we go right back to your core values, where, your mission, your vision, the values that you have in your handbook posted on the wall somewhere, those are your decision drivers. Those are the filters through which you make your decisions. So when you're making decisions about how to solve this problem, how to own it, how to take responsibility for it, you're asking yourself first, does what I'm planning to do next, does me taking responsibility for this in this way align with the values that are dear to me? There are probably, I don't know, 100 different topics that I sometimes work with early childhood educators on for personal development, professional development. I honestly can't think of one where we don't come in some way back to values, because your values need to drive your decisions, and then those decisions influence your behaviors, and then your behaviors become your habits, and those are the things you teach to others. And that becomes your reputation, right? That becomes what you're known for. I want to be known for caring deeply. I want to be known for acting with integrity. So I need to make sure that I'm showing up in the way that I consistently am taking responsibility for things in a way that aligns with those values. So I hope that that makes sense. The third point, solving it, it's summed up as determine what I can actually do. So this step involves taking action. So you're addressing the problem and you're actually finding a solution. It might involve collaborating with others. It might involve taking independent action, but it always involves a commitment that you're going to find a way to overcome this challenge. You're not just going to be like, oh, there's nothing we can do here. You're going to ask yourself, what else can I do? This might involve that second bullet there of redefining some boundaries. I recently spent literally a full day with a team focused on establishing boundaries, communicating boundaries to one another, to the families that they serve, to the community, and to one another, and then enforcing those boundaries in a way that really, really felt good in terms of their values and in terms of the way that they wanted to show up at work. That is hard work. Boundaries are hard. By nature, most of us in this field are helpers, we're compassionate. Many of us, that translates to being people pleasers. That translates to having blurry boundaries, or to letting people sometimes, quite frankly, take advantage of us, or sometimes where we accept behavior that we're not entirely comfortable with. Redefining boundaries right now in terms of the staffing crisis that many of us are enduring, that's becoming really tricky for some school leaders, because there used to be this line of, these are the behaviors that I would accept. And now that line is getting a little blurry, because it's feeling like, okay, I normally wouldn't accept this behavior, but I'm almost feeling like I'm held hostage by the staffing situation because I need to be in ratio. That type of challenge to your boundaries, to your values, that's really, really hard work. And I recognize that. It can be very difficult to work with challenges that do challenge your values and that do challenge those boundaries. So examining your boundaries and redefining them is sometimes necessary, but I am going to encourage you, both in terms of staffing and in terms of any aspect of this work that we do, that redefining boundaries doesn't have to mean lowering your expectations, okay? You are doing what I believe to be the most important work on this earth right now, in more ways than I can count. Your work with children is often life-changing. In some circumstances, depending on the circumstances, it can also be life-saving work. But every single day, you're showing up and you're doing work that really, really, really matters. And the high standards that you set for your staff, for yourself, you don't want to lower those expectations. You don't want to lower those expectations because your reputation relies on those high standards, and because you know that they're what's best for children. Okay, so that's sort of a sidebar soapbox issue there. But this determining what you can do to solve the problem, it really does sometimes involve redefining boundaries. It also sometimes means that you have to test your assumptions. They're in a career that's spanned more than 20 years, a lot of it in childcare centers. I really feel like most of the time when something happens, I have been through it once before. Like, I can rely on a learned experience of what happened last time. And sometimes that's great, because experience is a great teacher. I've learned what not to do just as frequently as I've learned what to do. But sometimes I then make assumptions about what's going to happen next based on what happened last time. And I need to test those assumptions sometimes. I need to challenge them. I can't expect that different people, different dynamics are always going to have the same result. So you do need to sort of be self-aware there. And when you're determining what you can do, be aware that sometimes relying on those assumptions might be a misstep. Then this last part here, recognizing that some things are out of my control. I am not good at this. Many leaders that I work with are not great at this, because I like to be in control. I like to be the decision maker. I like to be the person who establishes the boundaries. I like to be the person who knows that if A, then B, because it feels like I'm being of service in that way. That's part of the reason I think probably that I became a teacher first on, is because there is an element of control there. I could set the tone for these children. I could set these high standards. I could, by bringing my best self to work, I could bring out the best in that classroom environment. I had some element of control, or so I thought, until I actually got into the teaching career and realized that, like, particularly in preschool, so many things are outside of my control. So many things are outside of my control. I don't like it, but I'm aware that it's true. So recognizing that some things are out of your control can be a necessary strategy if you're focusing on how to solve it. Knowing that doesn't mean, though, just saying, oh, well, I can't do that because that's out of my control. It means that that's one element of your problem solving strategy, that, you're asking what you can do. You're looking at the boundaries. You're looking at the assumptions that you've made already. And then, yeah, there might be a few things you have to put in this column over here. I can't control this. So you focus on what you can. I do feel that in terms of personal development, that, mental health, wellness, well-being, that's a really, really significant statement. Focusing your attention on what you do have control over. You heard me say earlier that I love that statement, what you focus on grows. So when I am faced with a problem, that is one of my greatest wellness strategies, is focusing on what I can control. So whether it's something like I have demands from my elderly in-laws who are not in great health, and I can't control a lot of their behaviors or circumstances surrounding the stress that brings to me. But what I can control is my response. So I choose to focus on that. And if I choose to focus on being patient, focus on my own self-care, focus on what I can do in terms of making like organizational decisions for them, I focus on those things, and that's where I see growth. That works at a professional level as well as it does as a personal level. You know, your well-being as a leader is directly related to your well-being as an individual, and recognizing that some things are out of your control is great, as long as it goes hand in hand with focusing on what you can control. And I will say right now is one of those moments where I wish that I could see everyone's face, because it's so hard, webinar style, to not know if people are picking up what you're putting down. And I always look for the head nods. There's something like very reassuring about the head nod, or the smile from the familiar face, or the person who just looks like, yes, I want to be here. So I'm hoping that this is making sense, and that it's planting some seeds that you'll be able to bring back to your center in a meaningful way. That said, let's move on. Let's move on to that fourth step. Do it. That's pretty simple. That means taking action. You know, this final step of the Oz principle, it involves following through on the solution and ensuring that you implement it effectively. It means you're holding yourself accountable for the outcome, and that you're taking action to make sure that the desired results are achieved. I always keep in mind there that I'm also holding myself accountable to make sure that the outcome aligns with my values. The way that they strategize, or that they suggest to do that, the strategies are outlined on the screen here. You know, clarifying responsibilities, who is responsible for what, with a reminder that responsibilities are task-oriented. They are not necessarily results-oriented. So yes, you clarify who's responsible for what, but then you have to report proactively. You have to follow up. Notice it says following up relentlessly. You have to do what you say you'll do. You have to measure progress. And then last but not least, you tie it all together by accepting total accountability. So that means that if in that first step of clarifying responsibilities, that part of the solution of this problem means that I assign certain tasks to certain individuals, whether or not they are successful in those tasks, whether or not they meet the desired outcomes, I am still accepting total accountability for this solution. By taking action, I'm doing what I say I'll do, not just I'll try, but I'll get to this desired outcome. Okay, that can be tricky. I understand that. And all of this is pretty complex, but everything really is in human services, you know, these human interactions, there's all these different variables. But I will say that consistently, when you're following the steps of the Oz principle, we can become more proactive. We can become proactive in addressing challenges. We can take initiative. We can be accountable for our actions and our outcomes. And when what happens next then is that this can lead to really, really great things in the workplace. It can lead to increased motivation. It can lead to engagement. It can lead to increased productivity. And also it can lead to personal growth. And I really do feel like personal growth is really intimately connected with professional growth. Those two things go hand in hand in a really meaningful way. So the key steps of the Oz principle that we just reviewed here: see it, own it, solve it, do it. These can specifically be applied to educators too. And I like thinking about it this way, because sometimes I learn these things out in the context of a different industry or just leadership in general. And I'm like, how do we apply this in early childhood specifically? So let's take a look. Well, you know what? Actually, I'm going to take us back just a sec. So I'm going to take you back actually to this see it step. So this see it step, if we were to apply it specifically to early childhood educators, so this involves being aware of what's going on, both in the classroom and in the wider context of education. So in a classroom setting, this might mean being aware of the learning needs of each student. And then it might also mean being aware of larger trends or issues that are affecting education. It also might involve staying up to date with the latest research and practices in education. So seeing it in terms of an educator developing an ownership mentality, it looks like being really informed. It looks like getting lots of perspective, lots of feedback. It's not necessarily acknowledging a problem in this circumstance, but if we're looking at see it as a measure of developing this ownership mentality, that means things like staying up to date, being really informed, being invested in your personal development, being invested in your professional development, and really, really being aware of what people need from you. So perspective taking and problem solving in the bigger senses of the word. Along the same lines, if we look at this idea of owning it, taking responsibility for things and how it relates to educators, developing that ownership mentality, this involves taking responsibility for your actions and your outcomes, meaning that when you're showing up at school in a center, you are not only concerned with what goes on in your classroom with your students and your families, that you are taking ownership of the big picture. You are seeing that this center environment, this school environment, whatever your organizational structure is, that you are owning, that you are contributing to the outcomes of every student there by what you bring to the situation as a professional. You are taking ownership of learning outcomes for all of your students, but you're also contributing to the social and emotional development of everyone who has an interaction with you. You're contributing to the well-being or the lack of well-being of every person you interact with based on the quality of those interactions. Of course, it also means taking ownership of any actual problems that arise, challenges that arise with students or with families or with coworkers, and being proactive in addressing them. Being personally invested in solutions, being personally invested in the climate of your school, and making sure that whatever decisions you make align with your values in a really meaningful way. Along the same lines, if we are looking at solving it and how this relates to educators in particular, of course, it begins with asking, what can I do? What else can I do here? It might involve identifying the root cause of a problem that a student's having. It might involve finding creative ways to engage students who are struggling or disengaging. And it might involve applying what we know as teachers to our interactions with the adults that we work with too. Why is my coworker disengaged? Why does my coworker seem to be struggling? What happened here? How can I help? What can I do? Challenging my own assumptions, and yes, recognizing that some things might be out of my control, but really doing what I can to solve problems and contribute positively to any of the challenges that might be true in our center environment. Lastly, in terms of looking at how do it applies specifically to our learning environment in early childhood education, this involves really taking action. It's taking action to implement solutions that have been identified. So this means taking what you've learned for, if you're a classroom teacher, it's taking what you've learned in trainings and asking, how can I apply this in my classroom environment? If you are a center director, it's asking, situations like this, you're engaged in a webinar on a specific topic, you're going to have some slides and some notes, and I'll give you some follow-up resources. None of it matters unless you do something with it. I have this whole blog post where, because a soapbox issue for me is the fact that workshops don't work. And I'm a person who makes my living doing workshops. So I recognize that that's a weird thing to say, but I continue to say it because it's true. The beauty is in the follow-up. None of what I discuss here with you today matters unless you do something with it. So that means being proactive, being relentless in your follow-up, doing what you say you'll do. If you set some goals for yourself based on something you learn as a building leader, as a business owner, then you may have to make sure that you follow up. You have to make sure that you measure your own progress. And above all else, you have to accept that total accountability. So overall, the key steps here, these 4 aspects of the Oz principle, they can be applied to teachers because they can be applied to anyone. We are engaging everyone in this process of creating a culture of accountability, because that's where the ownership mindset takes root. That begins with some problem solving. That begins with taking ownership of your work, encouraging people to be proactive in addressing challenges, not brushing them under the rug, seeking to constantly improve your methods, constantly be a better person, be the best version of yourself showing up at work. When that happens, when teachers, coworkers, directors, managers, when they all work together to create this really positive and effective, affirming school climate, that's really the most beautiful reflection of your core values, isn't it? When you can see your values and your priorities shining through in other people's actions, that you've got a really good thing going on there. That your culture is rooted right where it should be, in the things that matter most to you. So, okay, there's a lot going on there, but I think you've got a good understanding. What I did mention earlier that I really love most, though, about the Oz principle, particularly as it relates to helping employees grow, is this focus on leading from above the line. So this graphic is a nice representation of the concept. Basically, above the line, you've got those 4 principles. Below the line, that's where blame lives. That's where we do blame storming, blame game, whatever you want to call it. Basically, this is a reminder that accountability is always above the line, always. That's where we find those 4 steps. That's where we see it, we own it, we solve it, we do it. Below the line, though, that's where we find blame and excuses. And that's not a comfortable place for anyone to live. And it's definitely not the place that we want to lead from. You know, it is human nature to fall below the line sometimes. But as leaders, we're called to pull ourselves up. Like we have an obligation, a responsibility. We're accountable for pulling ourselves up to being in a space where we can lead from above the line. Because when we embrace those 4 steps, that's when we're leading with integrity. And that, you know, when I think about what's the perfect reflection of your values, it's when you have multiple examples of leading from above the line. There is another graphic I wanted to show you. Okay, this is just another representation of the whole above the line, below the line thing. And there are lots of resources related to this online that I'm happy to share later. You know, if I think that Kangarootime posts this online in their Facebook community, and I can add some resources in the comments there. But what I like specifically here is that it gives us a little bit more of the nuance related to what below the line means. You know, when we ignore or deny a problem, when we use a wait and see approach, maybe no one will notice. When you cover your tail, that's their language. It made me laugh, cover your tail, but I think you know what that means. When we point the finger at someone else, or my personal, I was gonna say my personal favorite, but it's not. Whatever could be the opposite of your favorite, probably the one I dislike the most is, that's not my job, okay? I really do not believe that there is anything that can be expected of an individual in our work that is not part of their job. Because regardless of what your job description says, when you sign up to do this work, you are signing up to, you're accepting responsibility for being a role model. And that means that everything that happens in our life together, in our interactions together, our interactions with children, with coworkers, with families, that we have a responsibility to do the right thing, to act with integrity. So if acting with integrity is your job, there's nothing that falls in that category of that's not my job, right? So I am a big fan of this Oz principle because I feel like it really can have a practical application, regardless of the field that we're in, but particularly for educators. So with that in mind, I want to share with you a few things. A couple more, if you wanted just a basic summary of the see it, own it, solve it, do it. These are the 16 best practices that the authors do like to draw people's attention to. They have beautiful documents that give you lots of different behaviors, but these are the 16 that they identify as best practices for leaders. What I like most is that the work that I've done with this has suggested that if you just pick 3, and you make a meaningful commitment to 3 of the things you see displayed on the screen here, that you will have a meaningful impact on your culture. That culture, that impact on your culture, that's where you grow the ownership mentality. That's where it happens. The mindset shift doesn't happen with one behavior. It happens through these incremental changes that are rooted in really good habits. So for example, if you are looking at the do it column and you see that the 3rd item there says staying above the line by not blaming others. If you could look at a period of your work and you can say, I reliably lead from above the line. I do not blame other people, full stop, period. And then you combine that with something like, I'm constantly asking, what else can I do? How can I help? That's another version of that. What else can I do here? And then you combine it with one more, like asking for and offering feedback. I want you to think about that. Doing those 3 things consistently every day, they're absolutely aligned with your values. I don't necessarily know what your personal values are, but I do know that these things will be aligned. If you combine those 3 things, you will see a meaningful change in a significant way because you are acting as the role model for your team. And that's the primary driver of changing the behaviors and habits of your team members, is modeling the behaviors that you want to see, and then what you focus on grows. Drawing your attention with recognition, rewards, whatever your system is, drawing attention to the behaviors that they can duplicate, right? Okay. So with that said, we have just a few minutes left. I want to be respectful of your time. I definitely overplanned. So I have a couple other topics that are related to this, but we won't be able to dig into them. I'm going to tell you what the 3 things are that I have that I could dig into just a little bit more, and I'll be able to share one of them with you right now. One is about transparency, and each one of these is just about ways, strategies, things you need to know to cultivate that ownership mentality. So one is transparency, one is rewards and recognition, and one is work ethic. Okay, can you in the chat let me know which one of those is most interesting? And if I see that there is a consensus, so transparency, rewards and recognition, or work ethic. If we have one more thing that we can touch upon, which one would you like to touch on? And I'm going to take a peek at the chat. Work ethic. Oh, work ethic is coming up strong here. Okay, and that gives me a moment to look back to it. What else is in the chat, because I didn't know. Excellent. Okay. All right, so it sounds like work ethic, and I can share the resources related to all of them. But what I'm going to do now is stop sharing my screen, okay? And I'm just going to talk with you for a minute. I'm going to talk with you a minute about work ethic. Okay. So a key aspect of developing an ownership mentality is, of course, having a strong work ethic. That begins, though, with really understanding and developing a shared understanding of what you mean when you say work ethic, okay? To me, a strong work ethic involves a couple of different things. It involves being reliable. It involves taking initiative. It involves conducting yourself professionally, and it involves paying attention to details. There are probably more, but to me, when employees exhibit those traits, they demonstrate like a level of commitment and dedication that to me shows an admirable work ethic, okay? Like they've got values, they deliver on them, they pay attention to details, but then at the most basic level, they're reliable, they take initiative, and they hold themselves professionally, okay? Sometimes though, when I say work ethic, what people might mean is people who go above and beyond. And at the surface, that sounds good to me. I want people to go above and beyond in terms of passion, in terms of being proactive. But sometimes when I ask them to break it apart, what do you mean by going above and beyond? They mean the person who comes early and stays late and never complains about getting taken advantage of. Okay. And I want you to think about that one. I think that it is human nature to sometimes apply what we consider what is called a passion tax, meaning that we know that the work that we're doing and that our teachers are doing is really important and is really, really valuable. And they love children. And because you're doing it for the children, you should go above and beyond. We put a tax on that. That's what you call the passion tax. We keep expecting more and more and more from people. And we're not respecting necessarily the boundaries that they have established. So I'm just going to challenge you to think about your definition of work ethic to make sure you have a really good, clear understanding of what you mean, to make sure that it reflects your values, but then also to do the work to make sure there's a shared understanding there. You have to talk to your employees about what it means to you to have a good work ethic. They can't meet your expectation if they don't know it, right? But I mean, I understand a poor work ethic, it hinders people's ability to just engage, and it definitely detracts from their ability to develop that ownership mentality, whether they're procrastinators or they lack accountability or they're disinterested or they're inflexible or whatever. We have to recognize those challenges, we have to address them, but we have to start first with a really good shared understanding of what we mean by work ethic. We can't keep applying that passion tax. We need to respect that people have boundaries, and we need to understand what those boundaries are. Now, boundaries and flexibility are not mutually exclusive either, okay? There are, particularly in this industry, there are so many requirements for flexibility, meaning that, in a ratio-driven business, if the ratio has gone wonky, I need you to be able to stay late because safety is our top priority. There's no room for inflexibility there. A boundary is not saying I will never stay late. That is not a boundary. That's unreasonable. A boundary, though, is understanding maybe that this particular employee has established I am unavailable to return texts or phone calls after this time unless it is a true emergency. And that's where you have to have the understanding of what is an emergency? What's an emergency to you? What's an emergency to me? I will never forget getting a text message one morning to make a change to a document that was absolutely not essential, that absolutely could have waited until the next week, and that absolutely actually didn't even need me to be the one who made the change. And when was that text message received? Thanksgiving. Thanksgiving. I was off for the day. The business was closed. There was no emergency. And yet my boss, who was at the time the owner of the company, sent me a message asking me to do XYZ at this time. My boundaries were really blurry, and I needed to be sure that I had articulated them in a meaningful way. So when it comes to work ethic, the little piece of advice I'm going to ask you to take away is to really rethink your definition and make sure you're really firm on it, that it reflects your values, and then to have conversations with your team to make sure that they share that same definition. Your shared understanding is going to be the key to your success there. So in terms of big picture, because we're drawing on 2 o'clock now, and I do need to wrap things up, I hope that you'll take away those principles of those components of the Oz principle and see ways that you can apply them to your work. But above all else, I hope you'll keep in mind that the true heart of change is really identifying your values, letting that drive your decisions so that your behaviors, which are based on your values, become habits. People will observe those habits. You will see the outcomes related to those habits, and they will have a meaningful change on your entire culture, but specifically on that idea of ownership. You might be able to achieve that ideal reality of everybody comes to work striving for excellence, doing their best, and making decisions as though they really, really make a difference, because they do. So do you. So thank you for joining us this afternoon. I appreciate your time, and I'll be happy to follow up with Marissa to share some resources.
Thank you. Yeah, that was awesome. I know we have a lot of people waiting eagerly for those resources, so I'll definitely send those out tomorrow.
Okay, I'm happy to share.
Yeah, of course. Well, thank you again. I wish we had more time. I know, me too. Yeah, I think everyone definitely got something to take away from that. So that was great. I know I was nodding my head even though my camera was off, so I should have turned it on for you.
Thank you. You can just send me a little message. I'm nodding my head. But thank you so much, and I hope the same is true for others.
Yes, thank you again, Christina, and thank you all for joining. Keep an eye out for that email, and I'll send everything out tomorrow.
Okay, take care.
Thanks, guys. Bye.